I always tell my students a board member has to do three things. The first very important task is to ensure that the house is in order. So as a non-executive or supervisory board member, you have to make sure that the financial accounts, the risk management, the compliance are in order, and that you also have to sign off on them. So this is what I always call the housekeeping part. Then the second part, which is already more exciting, is strategy. So as a board member, you don't design the strategy, but you approve and challenge the strategy proposals of the management. And it's not only the overall strategy, but also the important specific strategic proposals like a big M&A or the building of a factory, a major corporate transformation, and things like that. And the last, and I think the most important role of a board is that you are the employer of the management. So basically, you look at the performance of the current board members, you look whether their profiles still fit with the future challenges, you decide to renew their contracts or ask them to go, you look for succession, and that's a very important part. And the other part, you're also responsible for the remuneration of the executive management. How much do they get paid, but also what are the KPIs and do they actually achieve them? So those three things are really the key tasks of a board. I would say the most important is that you ensure that the right management is there to run the company. That's the most important role, the employer role. Secondly, ensuring that the house is in order you do this on behalf of the shareholders and the other stakeholders. And it's really to create trust in the companies, that people feel comfortable interacting with the company and investing in the company. And lastly, and that's more on the negative side, if you look where companies really got in trouble, it very often had to do with governance, that there was no good countervailing power, there were too big egos, that people would run away with their ideas with no one challenging them, that there were big fights on the level of management or board members and owners. And so ensuring good governance is really important it's like a hygiene factor for a company to be able to function well. So you have, on the one hand of the spectrum, you have the listed companies, then you have listed companies with a strong anchor shareholder family, you have fully family-owned companies, and then you have, for example, companies owned by private equity, and they all have different dynamics. So listed companies are very much controlled by a number of corporate governance rules, by external shareholders who are at a quite large distance to the company. So they get a lot of responsibility themselves with deciding on, the mission of the company, what the company is heading towards, but at the same time have to adhere to a lot of external constraints and rules. On the other hand, family boards, very often family members are themselves a member of the board. And so the non-family members really have, in addition to the normal board tasks, an important task in understanding where the family is coming from. Some family board members are excellent, some are quite inexperienced. There might be tensions in family. So in addition to the normal work, you also have a bit of a counseling, sometimes even psychological role, making sure that the board functions well. And you might have less degrees of freedom, as the family might have very determined views on what to do and not to do. Private equity boards are very rational. They're much closer to the business than listed company boards. They have a shorter horizon because very often after 5-6 years, the company will be sold. And they're much more hands-on and challenging of the management. On the one hand, on the other hand, they do have access to a whole network of experts in the private equity firm who can actually help in certain aspects. So very different dynamics. And so when you join a board, you should be aware of that. And different boards also need different capabilities. Boards have a major influence on who is managing the company, but it also goes beyond that. So in some boards, like for example in Germany and France, employees are actually member of the boards. In other countries like the Netherlands, the Workers' Council can propose some board members, and the board actually meets on a regular basis with the Workers' Council. So there is in many countries already an intense interaction between employees and board. The board also looks at the culture of a company. If, for example, there's a major transformation, how does management approach the change management, and those kind of things. So it does have, although it doesn't actually manages the employees, it does have a big influence on the context. If you think about other stakeholders, and it can be direct stakeholders like suppliers, customers, those kind of stakeholders, but it can also be more indirect like NGOs or society at large. There will be trade-offs to be made between the interest of these various stakeholders. And management very often proposes those trade-offs, but they need to be backed by the board. So if, for example, you take a decision which in the short term lowers profits, but benefits certain stakeholders, you have to be aligned with your board. So the board backs you up when you get criticism around this. So this whole trade-off between stakeholder interest is something which ends up at the board table. So I've been on boards for the past 20 years of my life, and it's enormous, especially the past 10 years, how the job has changed. Specifically, it's become a lot more work. So in the old days, you could do 5, maybe even 6 boards. Nowadays, you cannot really do more than 3 serious boards. And if you're the chair of a board, it counts for 2. And what caused this increase of time? Well, I think the demands on what you do as a board member have risen quite significantly. If you go down the list, financial oversight. As a board member, you not only look at the financial accounts anymore. As a listed company, you also have to sign off on the internal control systems, the risk management, the audit, the compliance, and all those kind of things. The financial regulations themselves, in Europe, for example, the IFRS regulations, have become a lot more complicated and a lot more based on assumptions, which you really have to understand. Since the financial crisis, the demands on boards on what the remuneration policy should look like by shareholders, by proxy advisors, have gone through the roof. So there's so many boxes to tick when you design the policy. And at the same time, you have to explain management why this has to be that way. And so it has become a lot more labor intensive. And for example, as the chair of a remuneration committee of a listed company, you actually have to talk to all the major shareholders yourself, about 10, 20, in order to get the remuneration policy and report approved by the general meeting. If you look at things like, for example, the nomination, so the appointment or firing of executive board members and the evaluation of them. In the old days, the succession was very much based on networks and impressions. Nowadays, it's become a very rigid process where you really have to define a profile. What kind of profile do I need the coming 5 years for this company? How you assess people, not only interviews, but very often also psychological assessments of people. You look at succession pipelines internally much deeper. Who are the talents in the company? How are they being developed? How can they be ready to take on an executive position, board position in 2, 3, 4 years? So it's become much deeper and much richer than it used to be. If you talk about strategy, in the old days, you would have one strategy meeting a year for 1 or 2 days. You would deep dive and then you would decide on the strategy for the next 5 years. In the current volatile times, this is unthinkable. Things are changing so fast that you actually need to have a continuous strategy discussion and decide when you have to switch things. You have to be aware of what is going on in the world, much more than in the old days. So as a board member yourself, you have to spend much more time in understanding the environment and the newest developments, from geopolitics to AI to all kinds of other things. What you also see changing is the way of working in boards. If you are really honest, over the past 50 years or so, boards have been basically functioning in the same way. You had a board meeting every 2, 3 months. You would get a big pack of paper or PowerPoints to read beforehand. You would have 2 full-day meetings with committee meetings and presentations and some discussion. However, if you look forward, you see that that's not enough. First of all, what you see much more informal communication outside the board meetings. In the old days, a board member wouldn't interact directly with the management below the C-suite. Nowadays you do, of course, in coordination with the C-suite, to really understand what's going on, to deep dive on certain topics. You see much more calls in between to discuss urgent things. And also, if you look, for example, at AI, you even see boards which are already experimenting with an AI board member who challenges them on certain things like the facts and whether everyone had his input. So you finally see, after many decades of same ways of working, I expect that the coming years we'll see a fundamental shift in how boards work. Actually, the answer is going to be very paradoxically, because as a good board member, you need backbone and you need to be able to listen. What do I mean by backbone? That you should be able, as a board member, to stand up when you really feel some decision isn't the right decision. If everyone wants to do an acquisition and you believe it isn't the right one, or everyone wants to appoint someone for a CEO and you have a bad feeling, you have to be able to stand up, say your thing and fight for it. At the same time, it's become more and more important that you listen very carefully, that you really understand where your fellow board members, but also management is coming from. And it's not only listening with your head and the rational arguments, it's also listening with your heart. Just picking up the subtle signals, seeing how people are feeling. And it's really the combination of on the one hand, being able to stand for what you really think, and on the other hand, to be very open for input. So that's one thing. Being a generalist and a specialist. So in the old days, many board members used to be, CEOs, or for the audit committee, CFOs of company who were very broad, many years of experience. And what you see nowadays, because so many things are changing, be it in technology, be it in geopolitics, be it in other fields, that you do need people who understand that and are on top of that. However, you don't want to have people who are only specialists, because they cannot often take the big decisions you need to take as a board, because they don't see the whole picture. And last but not least, it's about experience and learning. So very often, because as a board member, you have very little time to take decisions. You're in a pressure cooker situation. It's this board meeting, you have all this information, you have to take big decisions. So very often people rely on their experience as a seasoned manager to take those decisions. However, at the same time, the world is changing so fast that many of the lessons you learned in the past are not valid anymore. So as a board member, you have to be humble and really learn what is the new time bringing and how is it different from the past. And so combining, on the one hand, this experience, which is still important in certain areas, and on the other hand, this openness to learning, I think is the third dimension, which is really important to be a good board member.